All right. Hey there, everybody out there in, Deer Park, LaPorte, Pasadena. Welcome. Today we're going to really kind of dig into something that I think is really, really important to all of us, especially those of us here in Southeast Houston, how we can all be part of making this, a better place to live.
Absolutely.
And I think like a good starting point for this is understanding that the decisions that are made about our local budgets, right?
Hmm.
Like our city councils. It's not just these like abstract numbers floating around. They really show what we value, what we prioritize as a community.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's often said that a budget is a moral document.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, and to dig into this more, we're going to look at a really fascinating conversation with Rick Cole on the Strong Towns podcast.
Right, Rick Cole. I mean, this guy's got experience,
He
right?
does, yeah.
Mayor, city manager, council member.
Exactly. He brings, that boots on the ground experience to this discussion
Yeah.
and a deep understanding of how communities work, how they're funded.
Yeah. So I mean, and that's kind of what, our goal is today, right? Like
Yeah.
taking his experience and kind of, extracting these lessons that can empower, you guys,
Right.
our listeners in Deer Park, LaPorte, Pasadena, to think and act locally,
Right.
like to make a real difference right here where you live.
Yeah. And Rick Cole, he's been involved in this stuff since he was young, even.
Yeah.
He shared an experience, going back to his high school days. You know, Pasadena, his hometown, they were the first city west of the Mississippi to have court-ordered desegregation.
Wow.
And, he talked about how, at that time, the adults didn't handle the situation that well. The students actually had to step up and lead. So, it shows you that sometimes local change starts with individual initiative.
Right. It's not always about waiting for the big solution from somewhere else. It's about seeing what needs to happen right here, right now,
Right.
and just doing it. And Rick, he really emphasized this power of focusing locally. He talked about the tangible impact you can have, working with people, real people, in your community and seeing those results firsthand.
Absolutely. And he talked about how important it is to actually have dialogue with people who have different viewpoints, especially in today's world.
Yeah.
Locally is where you have to engage with people who hold different opinions.
Yeah.
And he really values that ability to bridge those divides,
Yeah.
which is why it's so fascinating that after a long career in city management, he's back on the Pasadena City Council now after 29 years,
Oh, wow.
which just shows you his commitment to local action.
Yeah. That's a serious commitment. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this whole idea of budgets being like these moral documents
Right.
that Rick brought up. Like they're not just about balancing the books. They really reflect what we hold dear, what we actually prioritize as a community.
Exactly. And he uses a pretty basic phrase to highlight this.
Yeah.
You know, putting your money where your mouth is.
Yeah.
Essentially, the budget is where we actually make the decision about what's important and what's not. But he also pointed out that sometimes local governments can fall into this trap of just repeating the previous year's spending, maybe adding a little bit more,
Yeah.
but not really questioning whether those spending choices still make sense.
Right. It's easy to just keep doing what you've always done without really thinking about it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And Rick brought up this concept of zero-based budgeting, which, if you remember President Carter, that was kind of a big part of his platform. But basically, the core idea is every budget cycle, you kind of start fresh, right?
Right. Okay, if we were starting from scratch today,
Right.
how would we allocate our resources to actually serve the community?
Right. Right. And, talking about, how we allocate resources, he shared this really interesting statistic about the Santa Monica Fire Department. They had, I think, over 15,000 emergency calls.
Wow.
Only 47 of those were for fires.
Wow. 47 out of, what was it, 15,000?
Yeah, over 15,000 calls.
That's incredible. It really makes you think, what are our emergency services actually spending their time and resources on?
Yeah, exactly. So most of those calls were for medical emergencies. But then there were also things like, assisting elderly residents, responding to non-emergency situations at care facilities, helping people with mobility issues. And it really raises the question, is it the most effective use, and going back to Rick's point about the moral aspect, is it really the most moral use of these highly trained firefighters and all this expensive equipment to handle these situations?
Could those resources be better used in a different way,
Yeah.
to really meet the needs of the community?
I mean, it makes you think, right? Like these are incredibly skilled people with, we spend a lot of money on them, on their training, on their equipment. But, are those resources being used in the best possible way to actually serve the needs of the people right here?
Right.
I mean, and that's a question that, you should ask yourself.
Right.
Here in Deer Park, LaPorte, Pasadena, have you ever actually looked at your city budget and
Yeah.
thought about how that money is being divided up? Does it actually reflect, what you see as the biggest needs in your neighborhood?
Good question to think about.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, now we get into some of the inherent difficulties in actually, making changes, right? Like
Yeah.
in how local governments operate. And Rick pointed this out, we often see this pattern, right? Where it's like, oh, we've got this budget shortfall. Oh, no, we don't. We balance the budget. But, sometimes it's not very clear how that magic happens, right?
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of times that balancing act happens because there's a structural imbalance,
Mhm.
Like the costs of providing all these services
Mhm.
are going up faster than the money that's coming in.
Right.
That's a tough problem to solve in the long term. I mean, think about it. Like if your household budget is like that,
Yeah.
like your bills keep going up, but your income stays the same, you're going to have a problem eventually.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's unsustainable, right? And it's that fire department example, it illustrates how hard it can be to move resources away from these established ways of doing things, even when we have, information showing that maybe there's a better way, a more affordable way to handle, a lot of these calls that they get.
Right.
And Rick put it really well. He said, if it was easy, more cities would do it.
Exactly.
Right. Like that really gets to the heart of how these systems work.
Yeah. And Rick also stressed how important it is to actually use data to make these decisions.
Right.
Instead of relying on anecdotes or what's popular or just saying, well, this is how we've always done it.
That's never a good answer, is it? That's
Yeah.
how we've always done it.
No.
Not really. So what's a good example of this can really go wrong, right? Like when you don't use data to make these decisions.
Yeah, well, he told a story about budget cuts in Oakland and how when they had to make some really tough choices, what they considered essential wasn't based on any objective criteria.
Oh, wow.
It was based on which groups were the most organized and the loudest at city council meetings.
Hmm.
So, recreation programs were protected because they had a lot of people advocating for them.
Yeah.
But things like bridges and streetlights were kind of neglected.
Right.
And what happened? There was this street light that wasn't properly maintained and it fell and injured somebody.
Yeah.
Cost the city $17 million.
Wow.
That's what happens when you make these kind of reactive, politically driven decisions.
Yeah. That really shows you how that can really backfire in a huge way. So then, Rick kind of introduced this way to think about how effective our spending is, right? Like inputs, outputs, and then I think most importantly, outcomes.
Exactly. And he explains that, just putting more money into something, which is the input,
Right.
doesn't automatically mean you're going to get the result you want. The outcome.
Right.
You need to look at the outputs, what's actually being done.
Right.
But the real measure of success is, are we actually getting the outcome that we're aiming for? If we double the budget for domestic violence prevention,
Right.
doesn't necessarily mean that domestic violence is going to go down.
Yeah.
We have to look at how that money is being used.
Yeah.
What activities are actually happening. Are they actually effective?
It's going beyond just saying we spend the money, right? It's about, did it actually make a difference, in people's lives?
Right. And he connected this to, they spend a lot of money in LA County on the homeless crisis.
Right.
Billions of dollars.
Mhm.
And, voters even approved higher taxes because they expected to see results, right?
Right.
But the results haven't really matched the level of investment.
Yeah. And that raises some important questions about trust and accountability. What are we actually doing with these tax dollars? Are we using them effectively?
Right.
And Rick talked about his experience in Masusa, where when he was city manager, his thing was we're going to show results with what we have before we ask voters for more money.
Right.
It was all about building trust, being responsible with the money that they already had.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. Show people that you can handle what you have, and then maybe they'll be more willing to, give you more to work with. So, I mean, this all leads to this really important role that citizens play in all this, right?
Yeah.
And Rick's perspective on, I guess what he sees as a disconnect in this idea of self-government.
Yeah.
He talked about this tension between, people who want to shrink the government and people who just want more funding for programs.
Right.
But, he pointed out that, strong towns is about, a different way. It's about making the government more effective,
Right.
more responsive.
Yeah.
And he kind of laid out some different structures of local government, right? Like the strong mayor versus city manager systems, just to kind of give everybody a sense of who's running things.
Right. But, his most thought-provoking idea, I think, is about what the core purpose of local government really should be.
Yeah.
And he argues that it's to make the city safe and prosperous,
Right.
not just to run a bunch of departments like police and fire,
Yeah.
He admits that this might be a bit of a controversial viewpoint, but.
But it makes you think, right? Like, it gets back to that, like, Simon Sinek why.
Yeah. Right.
Like, we often focus on what they do, how they do it.
But we don't always think about, like, the fundamental reason.
Oh, why?
Yeah, exactly. Why do we even have this in the first place?
Yeah. And to illustrate this, he brought up a really fascinating point about the history of fire departments.
Oh, yeah.
And how they weren't always run by the government. I mean, you used to have to pay for private fire companies.
Oh, wow.
And then there were these other groups that would like show up at a fire and demand payment to put it out.
Oh, my God.
I mean, it wasn't until, the mid-1800s after, this huge fire in Cincinnati and somebody came up with a better fire engine,
Right.
that the idea of government-run fire departments took hold. And even then, people didn't really want the government involved.
That's amazing. I mean, it's a good reminder that all this stuff that we just kind of like take for granted now
Right.
had its own evolution, And Rick was really careful to say, he's not trying to criticize firefighters.
Right.
He's just trying to encourage us to, to think creatively.
About how we solve these problems today,
Right. Yeah.
And he made a similar point about policing. We need to really think about how we respond to these different situations. We can't just overload our officers with, every little thing from a minor argument to a bank robbery.
Yeah.
Maybe there should be unarmed responders for certain things.
Right.
And it costs a lot of money to have these highly trained and equipped officers for every single call.
Right.
And this ties in with the whole strong towns approach to streets, right? Like we have to think about safety and balancing different transportation options, not just about, making sure cars can go as fast as possible.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, Rick pointed out that, like, the core of making government work better is in budgeting.
Right.
And addressing, how we've been neglecting our infrastructure for so long.
Right. And this, comes back to that quote by Napoleon. Yeah, about the trees, right?
About planting trees. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a long-term vision.
Yeah. So, okay, so we hear a lot about these budget deficits, right?
Yeah.
And Rick made a really good point. He said, we can't just blame, whoever's in charge right now.
Right.
Yeah. A lot of this is because of long-term trends and how our finances are structured, right? He had this great analogy. He said, there's no royal road to geometry.
Right.
Meaning, if we want to really understand our local government, if we want to really engage with it,
Yeah.
it's going to take some effort.
Right.
We can't just sit back and expect our elected officials to just handle it all perfectly.
We have to get involved.
We have to, yeah.
More than just voting, right?
Yeah, it's more than just voting.
And he made this really interesting comparison to a vending machine.
Yeah, I like that one.
Yeah. It's like, we treat government like a vending machine, right?
Right.
We put our money in, we expect to get exactly what we want out.
Yeah.
And if we don't, we're upset, right?
Yeah, and he contrasted that with the idea of a barn raising.
Oh, yeah.
Like people coming together, using their skills, contributing their effort,
Yeah.
and then they have a stake in the outcome.
They own it, right?
They own it, exactly.
You're not going to tear down a barn that you helped build.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So, I mean, that's a great image, right? Like neighbors working together to build something.
Right.
And he told a story about there was this area in a park, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of neglected and dangerous.
Yeah.
And the residents, with a little bit of guidance and some resources, they just took care of it themselves.
Yeah.
They cleaned it up. They made it better. And that's what builds that sense of pride of ownership.
Exactly. And he makes a good point that, real trust in government doesn't come from having, these perfect leaders. It
Right.
comes from us actually being involved and engaged.
Right. And he shared this story about, when he was a new council member, he was asking all these, tough questions.
Yeah.
And the city manager, instead of getting defensive, he took the time to actually teach him about municipal finance.
Right.
And that gave him this much deeper understanding of how everything works.
Yeah. That's awesome. So, and then he used that famous Willie Sutton quote.
About banks.
Yeah. That's where the money is, to kind of make the point that, the budget is where, like, the rubber meets the road.
That's where the values are.
Yeah. That's where you really see what matters to the people running the government.
Absolutely.
And, we have to balance the budget, right?
Yeah, legally.
Yeah, it's not an option to just run a deficit forever.
Right.
So, and, despite all the, the craziness in national politics and everything,
Yeah.
What Rick found is that, like, at the local level, people are pretty reasonable, but, a lot of times they just don't know how things work. And part of that's because of, local news isn't what it used to be. And,
Right.
and these civic organizations that used to be so strong, have kind of gone away in a lot of places.
Right. Yeah, and that's why, what we're doing here is so important, giving people the information they need to actually make a difference locally.
Right. Like empowering people.
Right.
And that's the Strong Towns model, right? Start by observing a problem in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
Take some action.
Take action. Yeah.
So now we get to, the role of city employees and all this, and Rick talked about how, sometimes city professionals, planners, engineers, all those folks, they can kind of get in this mindset where they think, okay, our job is just to manage these services for the taxpayers.
Right. Great.
But, it's a little bit deeper than that. A lot of these professionals, they feel like their expertise is not valued,
Right.
and they get a lot of unrealistic input from the public.
Yeah.
Right.
And, Rick told the story about when he was mayor and they had this general plan, it was like 250 pages long, really complex document.
Wow.
And they had to put it to a public vote, which is not always the case.
Right.
But he used this analogy of a doctor and a patient,
Yeah.
like you have to have informed consent. And
Right.
And even if you're an expert, you have to engage with the public.
Yeah.
Offer them choices, build trust through communication.
Because, these days, everybody can just go on Google and, do their own research, right? So you have to be able to talk to people.
You have to meet them where they are.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and he talked about, the planners, they were
Yeah.
really hesitant to engage with the community.
Yeah, they were afraid of the same old stuff,
Yeah.
like the same 30 people showing up, meetings going on forever,
Yeah.
people yelling at them, you don't know what you're doing,
Right. You're the expert. So what happened?
Well, they actually ended up creating a really great general plan.
Okay.
It won an award.
Wow.
It got 58% voter approval, and it's still having a positive impact on Pasadena today.
Wow. So it actually worked.
It worked, yeah. And the key takeaway was that, the chief planner went from feeling like this, misunderstood expert to actually being a valued resource.
Right.
Helping the community achieve what they wanted to achieve.
Right. So it's a partnership. Right.
Yeah.
It's not just, the expert telling everybody what to do.
Right.
Yeah. So, Rick admitted that it's a lot harder to do this kind of, really engage self-government in a huge city like LA.
Right.
But he also pointed out that, like, this top-down approach where it's like, just stay home, we'll take care of it, hasn't really worked out that well either.
It hasn't, And he brought up this guy in LA, Kenneth Mejia, the city controller.
Mm-hmm. And he's done a really good job of using social media and, even humor to connect with people.
Right.
And he really pushes transparency and accountability. And he had a really impressive victory.
Yeah, he did.
And got a bunch of volunteers involved.
Right.
So, I mean, it's possible, right?
Yeah.
To get people engaged.
Yeah, even in a big city.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we're coming towards the end here, and Rick went back to that Napoleon quote about, planting trees,
Right.
and applied it to our infrastructure. Like, we neglect maintenance to balance the budget in the short term,
Right.
but the consequences of that, play out over years and years.
Right. And he argued that, our problems aren't just about not spending enough on infrastructure. It's also about, the way we're developing our cities.
Mm-hmm.
Like these sprawling patterns they're not financially sustainable.
Right.
Yeah. So he talked about how his own journey led him to the Congress for the New Urbanism because he was looking for better ways to, develop our cities in a way that makes financial sense.
Right.
And he found that in these new urbanist principles.
Yeah, which we've talked about before on the show.
Right.
So it was interesting to hear that's what kind of led him down that path.
Yeah. And he admitted that it's tough to change those patterns, even in a city like Pasadena,
Right.
which is, a pretty successful city.
Yeah, it is.
But they have a lot of single-family home neighborhoods.
Right.
People don't always want change.
Right. That's their investment.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. But, he emphasized that the benefits, they might not be immediate.
Right.
But in the long run, 20 years down the road,
right,
you're going to see a real difference.
You can see a difference, yeah.
Yeah. So, and then he brought up this current challenge that they're dealing with in Pasadena right now, Washington Boulevard.
Yeah.
Like, people are speeding like crazy on this street. It's like 84 miles an hour in a 35-mile-an-hour zone.
Wow.
Near schools, community centers. It's a real safety issue.
Yeah, it is.
And there was, I think, a fatal motorcycle accident.
Yeah.
And they had a walk and talk with like 100 residents to talk about it.
Yeah, they're going to have another meeting to discuss some different options.
Yeah.
And Rick emphasized that they have to be honest with people about, the cost of change.
Yeah.
Because, there are these quick fixes, like, just put more police out there.
Right.
But, maybe they need to redesign the street.
Yeah, which could be more expensive, right?
Right.
But it might be the right solution in the long run. So, and he closed by sharing this quote. I think it's from World War II, but I'm not sure. It's, out of money, we are going to have to think.
Right.
Like, that's kind of where we are now. We can't just keep spending our way out of every problem.
Yeah, we have to think creatively.
We have to think. We have to innovate, We have to find new ways to do things. And then he referenced Lord Acton's famous quote about power.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this less well-known corollary,
right.
Powerlessness erupts and absolute powerlessness corrupts. Absolutely.
Right.
And his argument was that, citizens have been kind of corrupted into thinking that government is just, it's the professional's job.
Yeah.
It's the politician's job.
Just stay home and let us handle it.
Yeah. And we have to shift away from that.
Right.
We have to take more responsibility.
Yeah, we have to be partners.
Yeah, it's a partnership.
Right.
And that's the heart of the Strong Towns movement, right?
Well,
and that's what we're all about here, In Deer Park, LaPorte, Pasadena, it's
absolutely.
It's hard work, it's slow work, but it's the work that matters.
Yeah. So for everybody out there listening,
yep.
In Deer Park, LaPorte, Pasadena, we've been talking about how just focusing our efforts locally can empower you.
Yeah.
To make a difference in your life, in your community.
Yeah.
And even small things, they can add up, to create big change.
Absolutely. So, whether it's, taking the time to look at your local budget,
yeah,
helping out a neighbor,
right,
picking up some trash,
right.
These little things, if everybody does them, they make a big difference.
They really do. And if you find value in what we share here,
yeah,
and you believe in this idea of local action,
yeah,
you can support us.
Yeah. thinkandactlocally.com/donate. You can find the link in the show notes.
Right. And as you're going about your week, just think about this. What's one small thing you can do to, be more informed, be more involved in your community?
Yeah, think about that. What's one thing you can do? All right, that's all for this week. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
See you next time.
See you.